Good morning, everyone. I am pleased to welcome you to the second day of the MAK'IT Talk, the monthly seminar series offered by the Montpellier Advanced Knowledge Institute on Transitions, MAK'IT. My name is Regina Herrera. I am the scientific officer of MAK'IT, and today I will have the task of presenting this conference.
Task of moderating the first of the three conversations we are having today. Three conversations that promise to be a very rich exchange of ideas and knowledge, a rich exchange of ideas about knowledge and how knowledge is collected, integrated, translated, and used to support decision-making. Before entering into the matter, I would like to remind you what the MAK'IT Talks are about. This is an initiative we launched last month, and the aim is to offer a forum for the exchange of ideas and knowledge, a space for the interaction of academic and non-academic actors from different disciplines, but also beyond disciplines. And this is why our first talk, the launch talk, was about transdisciplinarity. There are three characteristics of this initiative that I want to highlight today. The first one is that these conferences are open, so please pass on the invitation every time. The second one is that for every conference, every time, we try to bring together international experts and experts from the local community based here in Montpellier. So we try to put the light on the international experience, but also on the local expertise. And the third characteristic that for us is very, very important is that in this conference, usually our fellows, the MAK'IT fellows, also participate. So this is also a space to interact with them and to connect with the Montpellier community and vice versa. So today we will be talking about knowledge brokering at the science policy interface. And this is a topic that is very important for us here in MAK'IT, because we believe that a good interaction between scientists, decision makers, and society is very important to be able to produce policies that are relevant and are accepted by the society. Unfortunately, science and many other kind of knowledge is not always used effectively. And we are here today to discuss why this happened and what we can do to contribute to a better interaction between the different actors. I already mentioned that our first talk was about transdisciplinarity. We believe this sequence of things is natural because, as we will hear today, there are many voices that propose, that say that transdisciplinarity is perhaps the ingredient that we need to add in greatest quantities to improve decision-making. So this is a challenge, and today we expect to contribute to this issue. These three conversations will have three duos. We will have 6 experts, as I say, 3 international, 3 national. I will only mention the name of the expert now because we are going to introduce them more formally later. In the first duo, we will have Esther Turnhout Sélim Louafi that will be introducing us into the landscape of knowledge brokering, what it is for, how it is done, and what are the challenge we are facing today to better work in the interface. In the second one, we will have Sandra Díaz and Patrick Caron that will share their experience not only as experts in this interface, but also as coordinator, as president of 2 very important platforms, the IPBES and the HLPE, that contributed for informing the multilateral system.
And in the last one, Ishmael-Perkins and Helen Etchanchu will talk about science communication for sustainable transformations.
At the end of each conversation, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. So please don't be shy. You can come in front to ask your question. And after all the conversations are done, we are going to have a buffet lunch all together in this very building. We will give you the directions later on, but the idea is that you stay and share with us and take advantage to establish a new network, new members for your network. So Esther, Celine, it is a bit tricky to do a very short presentation of you because both of you have done many interesting things. You have, have a very wonderful intellectual production related with the subject we are going to discuss today. So I think I cannot avoid the pitfall of exaggerating with my summary, but here I go. First, Esther Turnhout, she is a full professor at the University of Twente in the Netherlands and the president of the chair in Science, Technology, and Society in the same institution. She is a social scientist, an interdisciplinary social scientist interested in understanding the interaction and power dynamic between different knowledge practices in environmental and sustainability issues. Esther has been active in the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, and her experience in this platform encouraged her to explore how to transform environmental and sustainability science to contribute to transformative change and human and ecological well-being. She has published numerous very interesting papers and books. I will only mention her book titled Environmental Expertise, Connecting Science, Policy, and Society, published by Cambridge Press. It's a recommendation for you. Esther has a background, she's trained in ecology, and then she did her PhD thesis on a topic at the intersection of policy analysis and science and technology studies. Sélim Louafi is the Deputy Director of Resource
French Agricultural Research Center for International Development.
CIRAD, based in Montpellier. His work focused in the interface mechanisms between science and public decision-making at the international level in the field of biodiversity and food security. He has held many important positions at the international scene, including FAO and IPBES. Also, he has provided support to different French expertise bodies working in issues related with biodiversity and food security. Celine started as an agronomist, and then he did his PhD thesis in economic, and then a postdoc in philosophy of law on the theme of building an international biodiversity agenda. So sorry for the short introduction. So Esther, Celine, after this presentation, can you please, I would like you to tell us briefly how you got yourself working in the science policy interface and what got you interested in this matter of knowledge brokerage. Please, the floor is yours.
Who starts? Sorry.
Esther?
Okay, I can start. I think so my study object has always been, since my PhD, the relations between science and policy. And in studying these relations, you find that that there's quite a few challenges. And interestingly, my own perception of those challenges did not always overlap with the challenge with how the scientists operating at these intersections would often experience those challenges. So I guess that there was that I saw an opportunity actually to use my the knowledge of my research in order to actually support these processes. And I think this got close to home when we did this article in Nature at the very start of IPBES, where a couple of my wonderful ecology colleagues at my former university started to call me out and said, well, you know, you wrote all this down. Are you going to do something? And this was the first time that I actually seriously considered that. And I thought, yes, well, I kind of have to. And that would be scary, definitely. And it is proven to be quite scary. But I've never regretted that. So I'm deeply thankful for my colleagues to say, well, Esther, are you going to stay the critical outsider and commenting on these processes, or will you actually help us?
Excellent. Sélim?
So thank you, and sorry for not being with you physically. I mean, in Montpellier, although I'm based in Montpellier, but now I'm in Rome. I navigated in this science policy interface arena with different roles along this spectrum as scientist, as a policymaker, or at least kind of, and as a broker at different points in time, actually. And let me give you a quick overview in chronological order. First, as you said, I was an assistant researcher at the Center of Philosophy of Law in Belgium, in Louvain, where I get familiarized with the different theories of governance, and more specifically with the reflexive governance theory developed in this center. And then after that, I worked in a newly established brokering organization, a think tank, between like research and policy in the early 2000s, IDRI, Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations in Paris, where I was in charge of the biodiversity program, and with the overall aim to engage more broadly research organization and various stakeholders in the biodiversity global policy processes that were taking place mainly at that time, but not only, at the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. Then I've been appointed as a deputy to the Secretary of the International Treaty, dealing with agrobiodiversity issue at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and for which I worked for 2 years and took part inside to the bureaucratic UN machinery to a highly polarized management of a global policy process. And this experience really brought me a lot of much more understanding of the political dynamic of an international policy process from inside, and what kind of empirical basis were missing to better conduct the negotiation process we were in charge of organizing. So after this policy experience, I returned to research to work as a social scientist in a biology research unit to help in the context of life science technical project to reflect upon and manage some aspects related to what Esther would call the politics of knowledge, as a way to manage the science policy interface, not just at the front end level of transferring findings to policy, but closer to the practice, the concrete hands-on practice of knowledge production at the micro level of project, by looking more closely to the condition under which knowledge is produced, and with the overall message that we already are making, in a way, some policy choice when we select discipline that will be included in those projects, when we select collaborator, when we decide to work on this or that crop, when we select when we access genetic material or select rules for data sharing. So this politics of knowledge cover, according to me, the three following dimensions: the interdisciplinary dimension of combining different disciplines, the disciplinary dimension of combining the diversity of actors involved, the social values that they carry, and the knowledge system for the construction of more actionable knowledge, and the reflexivity dimension regarding the governance of those research collaborative projects. And during this last period, and I will finish here, I also kept a direct involvement in science policy interface organization, such as IPBES, as a member of a task force on capacity building for 5 years, and the participation also to the international panel of the external evaluation of IPBES afterwards. I've also conducted more specific science policy interface activity in support to FAO work on genetic resources, And I've been nominated for 5 years also as a qualified member for the Economic, Ethical, and Social Committee of the French High-Level Council on Biotechnology. So for all this reason, SPI, Science Policy Interface, is a very concrete thing to me. And as a teaser for the rest of our exchange, I would simply add that what I gained from all this experience is the intuition that our science policy interface practices are still very much at their infancy. Thank you.
If I can resume, for the students that are here, I think there are very interesting things in your profile. First, interdisciplinarity, this is very interesting. Implication, I think this is key. Direct experience in doing things from the academic side, contributing to concepts and models, but also implicating in the practice. And critics, but as Esther says, not only critic to deconstruct things, but also to contribute to new directions, new challenges to work in this interface. So Esther, you have been very active in contributing to the questioning of the conceptual foundation of and current model of knowledge brokering. Will you explain to us what knowledge brokering is and why it is for? And also, can you guide us through the conceptual evolution of this practice, knowledge brokering? And finally, can you explain also what you call the different knowledge brokering repertories, please?
Yeah, sure. So that's an intriguing question, and there's a lot in that. I hope to do it justice. I guess that what I usually start the explanation with is that underlying the whole idea that we need science policy interfaces is the assumption that knowledge is somehow important and that science is somehow important. And this then can translate into a very simplistic understanding of how you would organize that communication, which is called speaking truth to power or the linear model, which could be seen as a way, as quite a unidirectional interaction. So scientific research generates results. They bring this somehow to policymakers, and then the assumption is that policymakers will use this for their decisions. Now, to be honest, nobody actually, although there's still this ideology somewhere underlying these practices, nobody really believes that that's enough. So we've seen some further sophistication in these understandings, where there is the recognition that scientists need to try to kind of adapt to the needs and requirements of policymakers. They need to understand what language they speak. They need to understand what concepts to use, what timing is important, how policymakers will use this. And on the other side of that relation, policymakers have started to understand that the questions that they ask of science are not always questions that researchers can actually answer. So this has led to the idea of knowledge brokering, which is usually the practice to change policy questions into researchable questions, and on the other hand, to translate scientific findings into what's been called policy relevant findings. At the basis of that model of knowledge brokering is still the idea that it's knowledge that goes from science to policy, and it's questions that goes from policy to science. And I think in my own thinking about knowledge brokering, I've started to appreciate what it takes for science policy interface to be successful. And we write about this in our book. So knowledge brokering repertoires that we've talked about in our paper focus on aligning the user demands to the knowledge supply. And how this works effectively is when what we call in our book, when knowledge and policy combine in shared frames. So they need to agree on the framing of the policy problem and the framing of the research problem. If you have that, you can have effective interactions. But, and this is where we come to the argument that we develop in the book and also in the paper, that understanding of effectiveness is an understanding that is elitist and quite closed down. So the interactions work well if there's a shared frame, but that's only, you can only have one frame. Now, in biodiversity and sustainability issues, there's always going to be multiple frames. So the effectiveness of a science policy interface is accomplished by means of exclusion. And this is why we actually introduced, also drawing on work by others, for example, Roger Pilkey, to really make a strong argument for a rather different knowledge brokering repertoire, which is to diversify. So the knowledge brokering repertoire of diversification is one that is important and really essential, not for the effectiveness of science policy interfaces, because it won't accomplish that, to be honest, but for the societal and democratic legitimacy of science policy interfaces, it is absolutely crucial that experts at the science policy interface open up before they close down. And perhaps they never close down. But first, we really need to question these problem frames, both the framings of research problems and the framings of policy problems. Because if we don't do that, science policy interfaces will serve dominant problem framings, and they will serve the interests of dominant actors. Again, we might call this effective, and we might think that it is important to serve the needs of elites. I'm not necessarily contesting that, but I do want to really suggest that that's not always the best idea. So opening up, diversification is a knowledge brokering repertoire that is really very challenging, but absolutely crucial, I would say.
And I think this is the perfect ending for the question for Sélim, because Sélim has also been very active in contributing theoretically, and he has a proposal concept that is called social representativeness. Can you explain, Sélim, how this is different from the classical understanding of inclusion and representation, and why it is important in knowledge brokering, please?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. And let me say that I agree 100% with all what Esther has said right now. And before responding more specifically to your question, let me start by explaining why I said that our science policy interface organization are still in their infancy. And that's actually is the observation that despite the wealth of organizations that are positioned to handle this science policy interface, the very design of those organizations, the narratives and the corresponding practice on which they build their legitimacy remain inherently trapped in three persistent cliches that does not really permit to manage really more fruitfully this interface as described by Esther. And the first cliche is the one that considered that science is there to respond to requests by policymakers to help them to fix their problem, the policy on top and science on top. And the COVID crisis, at least in its first phase, has strongly reactivated this vision of science at the service of political decision making. And you would find that also in international negotiation on the environment, where this cliché remain a powerful reference point for ensuring the primacy of what is and what is not legitimate to include in a decision-making process. So if science is called upon to produce politically relevant knowledge, it cannot become prescriptive on the decision to be taken. That's the kind of mantra that it's still a very powerful one, including within IPBES or IPCC. The second cliché is the one that, as Esther has said, and it's this idea that science should speak truth to power by considering that science is there to provide data and evidence for better informed policy. And according to this vision, science gains credibility by staying as far away as possible from politics. And it is first of all a question of establishing a consensus between scientists before addressing to decision maker. And those consensus are there in this kind of cliché to act as an electroshock on politics. And unfortunately, as we all know, the effect of those diagnoses about the situation of biodiversity or climate change disappear as quickly as they appear. So the third cliché is the one that look at this interface through cynical lenses as a way for scientists to push for their own career and agenda, and for politicians to lean on science to legitimize decisions that they have already taken. So what is important is that the two first clichés, share a common vision of politics and science as belonging to two different realms, two different worlds. It's a logic of demarcation that aims to avoid this third cliché by affirming a clear distinction between political and scientific authority. And that's this brokering repertoire, as Esther would say, is, I think, very much still entrenched, especially in the scientific world, for whom policy necessarily means something dirty, something that you still need to shy away because of the risk of losing your credibility as scientists. So, and as long as the knowledge brokering repertoire remain based on brokering between two social orders that are conceived as separate and not intertwined, and we will remain ineffective in managing this interface. And social representativeness was a way for us. I've conducted this work with my colleagues Jean-Frédéric Morin, Amandine Orsini, and Mohamed Oubnal, was a way for us to point the finger on the interface challenges that need to be managed to ensure that we precisely bring the maximum perspective that will eventually be needed to take action and have an impact on decision making. And those challenges are at the number of 4. As I said, the epistemic challenges avoid that one discipline take a kind of dominant voice in those international processes. And here we have a good example in IPBES with the overrepresentation of the ecologist as a discipline, as a legitimate discipline to really say the truth about what is biodiversity. And then you have the horizontal challenge to ensure a good representation of the diversity of sectors and issue area. When it comes to biodiversity, for example, one needs to go beyond the environmental perspective that still predominates and include also agriculture, development, culture, trade, and industrial issues. So that's also this more horizontal challenge is also something that need to be represented in those science policy interface organizations. The third challenge is the vertical one of combining the different level of governance from local to global. And the fourth one is the temporal challenge of reconciling short-term and long-term perspective. So that's the kind of idea that was behind this idea of social representativeness, by making sure that all those different challenges, the 4, will be taken care of and represented in the way we design the science policy interface organizations. Thank you.
Thank you. We are running late and obliged to contain my comments to all these very interesting proposals. And also Esther, Celine, and we are going to leave the question about the characteristic of knowledge brokers for the discussion with the audience. And I would like to ask you about the diversity of the advisory systems. And Esther, in one of your latest papers, you have done very interesting proposals. There has been around a lot of talk about creating new and better knowledge brokering organization. And you have taken a critical stance in this regard, and specifically for knowledge brokering food system policy. You have stated, and I try to quote, that improving the knowledge policy interface only makes sense if it can really contribute to the needed food system transformation. Transformation is a word that we love here in MAK'IT. But I would like to know what specifically do you mean by this, and what are the requirements for these organizations to really contribute to the necessary transformation we are talking about during the last 10, 15 years, please.
Yeah, so there's quite a few reasons why, when we first heard of the idea to propose a science policy interface or an IPCC-like body for food, drawing on the experiences that we've had with the authors of that paper in all kinds of science policy interfaces. I think one of the first ones is the understanding of how political food systems governance is, and really questioning the idea whether in such a context science can make a difference, whether it also, if there's no intention to also globally organize governance on a global level for food. And I think we are seeing very few signs of that at the moment. Why would you do that? If you're unhappy with the current institutions that you have in place, such as the high-level panel of experts and the CFS, what can you really do to ensure that any new body will not just repeat those problems? So we were quite skeptical about that. But then another quite important reason is that if you think that the synthesis of scientific knowledge is important for governance, you have to really look at the availability of knowledge, because any body that has as its mandate to synthesize existing knowledge will reproduce the biases of that knowledge. Now, in biodiversity, this is a concern that I've had. In food, this concern is multiplied, because knowledge inequality in disciplines, in approaches, in the things about food systems that they study are massive in the food domain. Only 70% of global farmers are smallholders. 5% of the total knowledge that it's created is relevant for smallholders. So the large majority of research about food and agriculture is about modern, Western, industrial forms of agriculture. Any scientific assessment body will reproduce those biases, so it will actually worsen the problem of knowledge inequality. And it will worsen the case for organic and agroecological forms of farming, because these will be the forms of farming where a body like an IPCC for food will inevitably have to conclude there's limited evidence and it's unresolved and there's lots of uncertainties. We are not actually sure. So the third reason for being quite skeptical about an IPCC for food is also related to that. I mean, if you don't have a clear policy audience and you don't have a clear governance willingness at the global level, if you have huge problems in your existing knowledge base, a body like this will only be used to not govern food systems. And I think we see a lot of the misuse of science in order to actually avoid decisions, to delay them because of uncertainties, complexities. We're not really sure. We'll do another assessment that will keep us occupied for a number of years. And we have a good excuse not to do anything. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and Celine, you also you have a similar view than Esther about insufficiencies in the current science policy interface. You already mentioned it at the global level. Could you tell us, based on your experience working for some of these platforms, what works well and what doesn't work well, complementing that fact that said Esther, and what is missing and what is needed for them to be more impactful on decision making, even when we just already discussed that effectiveness is relative, it can be interpreted in different ways.
Yes, thank you, Thaura. And let me start with making two important disclaimers in order to get a better sense on how and to what extent the role of knowledge brokering plays out. First, governments always need to make decisions in absence of conclusive evidence, and government rely on much more on other consideration than science, than evidence and science to make their decision, which in many cases could precisely be a non-decision, pretending that we don't have enough evidence. So that's the first disclaimer. And the second one is that it's also important to acknowledge that brokering role takes place within a broader kind of science advisory ecosystem in which include knowledge generator, knowledge synthesizer, and knowledge communicators. And the brokering role can only build on the knowledge that is produced. And as Esther had said, there is all this undone science, which cannot be invented by any brokering or broker organization or individual. So as I said, I'm this whole week at the FAO Science Forum, and yesterday a special event on science policy interface has taken place, in which various scientists have taken the floor. And I cannot tell you how many times the issue of science policy interface was only looked at from the point of view of scientists, blaming policymakers and their lack of will, their lack of scientific culture, their lack of institution to support and to make use of the evidence that is already there. And when it comes to looking at the science and its responsibility, the only problem that was identified was the one of communication. We need to improve the way we communicate about our findings. So as long, again, as we stay in this kind of very simplistic approach to knowledge brokering, we will and not question the way and how knowledge is produced or not produced, to improve credibility, but also legitimacy and relevance of the knowledge, then we will continue to miss the point. And that's really not something easy to grasp for scientists. Let me give you one example of one of our recommendation from the panel of IPBES was to say that we need to think about the assessment that IPBES was doing as a process rather than simply a product. And the way it has been interpreted by most of the scientists and even the bureau members and the secretariat was we need to enhance outreach activities, communication, once the assessment report is completed. So the process for them was the selling of the report. And obviously this is not what we were meaning. Rather, it was about really paying more attention to the way the assessment itself is designed and concretely organized before arriving to an end product. And that matters a lot. And I will not expand on that because Esther has already described that, the importance of that. But let me finish with a very important observation that I would like to make before concluding, is that paying attention to the process of knowledge production rather than the end product, the findings, and helping to design this knowledge production in a way to reconcile credibility, relevance, and legitimacy is really the signature recommendation of a whole stream of literature, which is called STS, Science and Technology Studies, which gains its legitimacy by criticizing the linear model of knowledge creation, diffusion, and then utilization in research and innovation, mainly in experimental sciences. Unfortunately, the very same people who are part of this STS community are themselves trapped into this linear model, hoping that their findings and publication will be taken up by scientists and policymakers for the design of SPI organization. So with few exceptions like Esther, I'm really struck to see how little influence this particular community, the STS community, who have an extensive experience in SPI, including with a very strong empirical basis, have still very little influence on SPI design and functioning. And this is definitely an area in which there is enormous room for improvement, and for which I myself very much interested to act upon in the upcoming months and years at CIRAD, and with the help of the University of Montpellier and MAK'IT more specifically. And this means not just bringing more individual experts on SPI into SPI organization, but to be faithful to their own recommendation, imagine new way of co-producing knowledge on SPI with a range of discipline and actor to ensure wider relevance, legitimacy, and eventually have their recommendation better taken up for the design of SPI organization. And as I said in the beginning, I've experienced myself this STS in action approach at the micro level of specific research project in life science. And what we need now is to scale up this approach at the meso level and establish a new SPI space that will deal with SPI design and functioning, a kind of SPI on SPI, but not only comprising, obviously, academic expert on SPI, but also all the actors involved in this knowledge production about SPI that would produce recommendation and guidelines on how to design and manage science policy interface organization. I think, and I finish here, we desperately need this reflexive step if we want to move from infancy to adolescence, I guess, and be able to change the narrative and move away from the three persistent cliches that still populate our environment on SPA, on science policy interface. Thank you very much.
Can I respond to that?
Yes, of course.
Because thank you so much for raising this point, that I feel the need to respond, because honestly, my and I've shared with, of course, other there. I think that there's very few STS researchers on environmental issues that have not actually attempted to improve these relationships. But I can, we could do an entire talk about how extremely difficult this has been, how much outright resistance, pushback, and marginalization we continue to face in our efforts. So I'm on the verge of giving up all the time. So the way in which this type of expertise about knowledge policy interactions gets pushed back, gets marginalized, gets dismissed, and gets treated quite violently in these SPI processes should not be underestimated. So the resistance to transformation of science policy interfaces comes from within.
Yes, no, I agree.
I know, but I felt like I needed to say this. It's really, really hard.
So just quickly, what I would like to suggest is to think collectively and not as individual going in the fight as a kind of lonely fighters. That's my point. Okay, yes. I stop here.
No, thank you. Amazing discussion. I think I don't really, there is no need for me to summarize anything. These are very relevant, important, and very clear contributions. I think we can give floor to people to ask questions, and I will ask Myrti, who is also connected in line to start. She has just left her lever la main pour faire des questions. Hello, Myrti. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. And I must apologize as well for not being here in person like Sélim, because I'm also based in Montpellier, but I have a cold. So thank you very, very much, Sélim and Esther, for your presentation, which aligns exactly with the kind of work I have been doing around formalizing emerging answers to those problems that comes from communities of scientists, researchers, and practitioners around the world. So they don't come from a policy perspective, but the policy science interface is the logical conclusion. And essentially, we are converging to exactly what you're saying from different horizons. So for those who don't know what we're about, we've been trying to essentially, we haven't tried, we have identified that farmer-centric on-farm experimentation is emerging independently across the world as a way to do exactly what you described, a way of essentially aligning the different framings of issues that exist for each of the stakeholders, be it the farmers, the scientists, the local governance, the funding bodies. Another way to talk about this is business models and value proposition alignment. So we're along those things, and there's also that idea of being sustainable. So I suppose what I'm saying here is that there is a convergence. But what is the next step? Because like you said, Esther, perhaps in ecology, you have a longer experience of trying to achieve those things. So having participatory processes that have reached the governance level. But there's pushback, and there is at multiple levels. So essentially, what is the next step? In our situations, we are still trying to identify key people in policy or science, as well as decision makers, that essentially are able to communicate these things. I mean, in the world of agronomists, nobody knows of what you're talking about here, at least not in my world. And that's I represent not only the broader world, but also subsistence farming. So what's the next step, essentially, practically?
Thank you, Myrti. Céline, Esther. Who wants to answer first? Céline, Esther?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give it a try because I think what you describe is really wonderful, and I think if in these close interactions, you're not just filling the knowledge action gap. Knowledge becomes action, and action becomes knowledge. Right? It's really an entanglement of these two things that we conceptualize as separate. But of course, if we think about how we know that it is doing. And if we think about how we do, we know that it is because that we have knowledge guide these actions. So the separation is conceptual, but then the separation is institutionalized as well. So what I would want to achieve in my own university is to simply have much more scientific capacity available for these processes. And of course, this requires changing incentive systems in the university. Now, when it comes to then making a policy case out of all that knowledge, it's really, I don't have the answer here. But what I would suggest, and what I'm also trying to do, is to join forces with social movements, because I think social movements are much better able to connect their needs, including their knowledge needs, to policy processes. And I think so instead of thinking again from our own perspectives, what should we be doing as scientists and making ourselves so important again, we can also consider who can we support, what's already ongoing that we can support. The third answer I would have for this is somewhat of kind of reflects my own dilemma, because one of the things I've really learned about the IPBES global assessment is that, and also about what is going on at the moment in the Netherlands on the basis of IPCC, which is that actually these global reports, they might not influence policymakers who did clap and approved all the conclusions. Maybe not. But what it does do is that it provides arguments for social movements. So in the Netherlands, we've seen an NGO that won a court case against Royal Dutch Shell using the IPCC. Now, the IPCC was not enough for that, and the story is complicated, but because the IPCC evidence could be combined with human rights law, they won that court case. So if you have these agreed statements in these high-level reports, and you can show that your government has agreed to these statements, if they continue to not practice what they promised, you can take them to court. So multi-level accountability dynamics can be supported by this linear model. I had a hard time accepting this as a conclusion, but I thought that is, if global reports have a use, it's this. It's not maybe to influence governments, that would be nice. But through multi-level accountability dynamics could be more effective. And what that means for global assessment processes is that we have to think much, much differently about who our audience is. And that requires what Sélim was suggesting, that requires changing how we do an assessment and who we listen to, who gets to influence the scoping report, who gets to review draft reports, who do we talk to through in the process of creating these assessments. That has to, of course, then include organizations such as yours much more explicitly and much more deliberately. That I think, if we want to keep global reports, this would be the next step. Address the needs of those that are much more likely to make good use of it, than governments, perhaps.
Thank you. Sélim, we have 1 minute for you to add something.
For me, that echoes what I was saying, that we need a learning process fed by the kind of experience at the micro level on how to manage science policy interface and at the meso level. And that's what is probably missing, a kind of build a community, SPI organization on SPI, to learn from like this kind of bottom-up experience in different topics. The one that you've mentioned, on-farm experimentation, we can have other and try to make a sense of like build new recommendation on the design of SPI at the macro level, at the policy level, but also at the project level. And that would be, I think, something which does not currently exist and which is desperately missing.
Thank you. I think we can take one question from the audience. Is there any? No? Okay, so Esther, Sélim, thank you very much. I invite you to stay if that is possible. I apologize because we accumulate a lot of delay for external issues, but thank you very much. Very important contribution, and we hope to have you again very soon participating in our conference. Please feel free to stay. And now I will call my colleague, Marianne Chomel. She will be in charge of moderating the second conversation. And I also invite Patrick Caron and Sandra Díaz to come to the table to get ready to answer all the questions we have prepared for them. And very, very nice to have you all here. And we are going to stop for just 1 minute to allow them to install at the table.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for being back in the room. We will resume the discussion with our second eminent duo. And Sélim and Esther, in the first one, introduced us to this concept of knowledge brokerage and what does it mean. And now we would like to discuss a bit more in detail a specific example of a knowledge broker. The example of expert committees in multilateral organizations that have strong impacts on intergovernmental negotiation. We will focus on two specific organizations, the IPBES, which is the high-level, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service, which sets up several expert platforms and task force, including the multidisciplinary expert panel, and we will focus on this specific body. And the Committee on World Food Security, which is a UN body in Rome, which has set up also a high-level panel of experts during its reform in 2009. So we are lucky enough to have with us today two leading figures of these two expert committees, and I will try to introduce them quickly. It will be a difficult task because both of them have many hats, and I will start with you, Sandra, if you allow me. You are a professor of community and ecosystem ecology at the University of Cordoba in Argentina, and you are investigador superior. I'm trying to get the accent, the Spanish accent, which is the highest academic position in Argentina. At the Argentina National Science and Technical Research Council, CONICET. You are a founder and director of an international initiative called Nucleodiversus that conducts research in the areas of biodiversity, ecosystem, and sustainability in response to socially relevant problems. So we are really in the topic of today. You are a specialist of plant functional traits, and you have authored more than 150 scientific publications, many of which in leading journals, and you are among the world's most cited authors in your field. You are a member of a series of academies and panel, including the Academies of Science of Argentina, of the US, of France, of the developing world, and I'm stopping here because there are many others. You have been awarded several international distinctions, such as the Cozzarelli Prize of the US National Academy of Science. And you have served, and this is really important for today's discussion, in a leading position in IPCC for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessments in Future Earth, and in IPBES, where you were the member of this multidisciplinary expert panel I mentioned before, and you also co-chaired the global assessment report of the platform in 2009, and for that you were nominated as one of the 10 most prominent scientists in the world by Nature this year. So we are really lucky to have you with us. Patrick, I will also try to summarize because I'm also lost, even if Patrick is the director of our institute, MAK'IT, and he's also the vice president for international affairs at the University of Montpellier. You are a veterinary doctor, but you have also a PhD in development geography. You are a specialist of farming system and territorial dynamics, both in Latin America, Africa, and the Near East. You joined the French Agricultural Research Center for International Development, CIRAD, in 1988, and you occupied several positions in CIRAD from that time. You also are the authors of many publications in international journals, and you are very active on the international scene as well. You are now a system board member of the CGIAR, Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. And from 2015 to 2019, you were the chair of the HLPE, and that's why we are happy to have you today for this discussion. And Selim mentioned it before, you were yesterday in Rome to participate in a high-level panel of the FAO Science and Innovation Forum on science, policy, and society interface, opportunities and challenges. So that's perfect. You are coming back with plenty of ideas and points to discuss, I'm sure. A bit as in the first panel, I would like to start by asking you what brought you actually to these expert committees. How did you integrate this platform that have strong interaction with governments? Can you give us a bit more detail about your own background? Shortly, I will be strict on time. I'm sorry. I will give you about 3 minutes to answer each question so that we could also have some interaction with the room. Sandra, would you like to start, please?
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. For me, I'm going to talk mostly about my role of co-chair of the Global Assessment on Biodiversity of IPBES. For me, it was hugely challenging and incredibly rich and, to be honest, pretty exhausting process. The most challenges of it was the social part, the coordinating of large heterogeneous groups of people. I wanted you to give a glance of the main actors here, my co-chairs, Joseph Setele and Eduardo Brondicio, and our truly heroic technical support unit, Yen Go and Max Guess. And in terms of the team of authors, if we can have the second one, this is an idea of the size and the composition of the whole undertaking. So I am a classic research academic. So this for me was a dive into the very deep end of the pool of knowledge brokers, as you probably imagine. The most challenging and the aspect in which we learned the most was in terms of the social skills to manage this very heterogeneous and very big group of people towards a shared scientific vision. We did have a very clear vision. We wanted a summary for policymakers, that it was compact, that it was integrated across sciences, that it was memorable. We didn't want a summary that would be a blunt monster trying to please everyone. And in order to deliver that kind of vision, we needed a tight leadership across the whole process. That was the stronger learning. Also, I learned many other things as a researcher. I got my whole intellectual landscape open up enormously, and I was able to frame my own research in a completely different framework, a framework I couldn't have before in the light of all these interdisciplinary and intersectorial contexts with actors I never interacted before in my daily practice. Other things I learned is how far is the average product we do as academic researchers from the needs of policymakers, how rocky the path is between the scientific product and the policy making. That's why I found the first two talks so interesting. I also was amazed to find gaping holes in the evidence, holes you didn't believe weren't filled before. For example, there were myriads and myriads of examples of impacts, local impacts of drivers on biodiversity everywhere, but there was no single stock taking of what are the main direct drivers of biodiversity loss at the global scale. So we had to do our own systematic assessment in record time. An example of that, sometimes the scientific community doesn't really know what the policy-making community needs. Basically, the most challenging bit, and it was to navigate this really treacherous strait between the experts on the one hand, all these 450 people writing that wanted all the details and all the uncertainties in and all the papers cited. And on the other hand, the policymakers who wanted take-home messages that were as precise and unequivocal as possible, but at the same, they didn't want us to tell them what to do, and they never want their country look bad in the report, never ever. And then you have the NGOs that tend to have highly compelling but sometimes simplistic storylines. And last but not least, the skeptics, sincere or otherwise, they're always looking for cracks to claim that there's not enough evidence. So that process of navigating of all these very different social actors was what I learned the most, but at the same time, what I found the most challenge. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sandra. It looks an interesting process, and we will see if Patrick is sharing the same experience. What kind of personal journey has it been for you as a scientist to go to these platforms and to negotiate with member states?
Thank you, Marianne. Good morning to all online and in the room. Well, first of all, I was not born as a scientist. I became, and I was not born as a researcher. I became. And I come more from the development side, and I joined research a bit later. And then when I joined research already in what was called at that time the system thinking community. That was a research that aimed at understanding the complex processes, why action is taking place, why it is not taking place, and sometimes we were also criticized by the other type of science community for being so critics. But this is the background I'm coming from. And then when, Marianne said I was in CERAD much later, in 2008, more precisely, there has been a crisis that has been related to food in the discourse. It was not just about food and about agriculture, but and then there was a need for such a reflexivity at the global level, because in 37 countries there have been riots in the same time, and there was a need to understand that, and that was the moment when the international community said we have to understand this complexity. This was the birth of the high-level panel of experts of the UN Committee for World Food Security. The committee, the CFS, already existed, but it was not based on science, and they wanted to do so. And I follow up the birth of this panel. That was exactly the same time as IPBES was created, and that was also a kind of consequence of the success of IPCC, because everyone at the same time wanted to have its own panel and to create its own panel, although in the food sector, and that's important when I heard what Esther said, in the food sector, the landscape is very populated, differently from the environmental sector. The environmental sector with IPCC and IPBES, this was a recent process, but in just an example, in the food sector, you have the FAO, right from 1945, that collects data and that makes synthesis, and so it does not articulate necessarily as IPCC has done, but it was, so it's a bit different. And then my journey in that, so I applied, I was selected, okay, and in 2015, and my feeling then was a mix of three feelings together. The first one, surprise. Surprise because of the rules. For example, scientists speak quite freely. When you want to express yourself, you say it. When you come in such arenas, you, even if it's a scientific group, you first look at the consensus among your peers before expressing yourself, because you express yourself on behalf of an organization. And for a scientist, it's a big surprise. I say this surprise, there are other ones like the difficulty to understand each other when you come from such different backgrounds. The second is an excitement because you have the possibility of, maybe we'll come back on that later, but to shape the agenda with the reports. That means you do not necessarily generate direct impact on action, and that was very well said. But then you put on the table the questions and the agenda, and I could provide example with the emergence of the food system narrative, the emergence of the interest for agroecology. These were very interesting issues, and what really strikes me as and excited me is that you are looking for a grammar and a vocabulary to understand action, but also to understand inaction, why decision is not made, and how what are the looking, and to go and to move beyond based on such understanding on the contradiction, on the polarization. And in the food sector, you know how big are such polarization. And of course, some disappointment. So surprise, excitement, disappointment, because you always want that the pace of action is aligned with the pace of knowledge, of producing knowledge, but it's not the case. And I can come back on that. And I will just finish to say, indeed, this experience from 2015, 2019 changed my life. Because first of all, MAK'IT is also resulting from that, and from the willingness to address the controversies, to address the divergence of opinions and views, and to address it through a multidisciplinary angle. And the other issue that it changed, I got involved in what we can call mediation, mediation in the sense of understanding why we don't agree, what are the reasons for not agreeing, what are the motives for not agreeing, what are the reasons, and how you can gradually move from a disagreement on disagreement towards an agreement on disagreement, towards a disagreement on agreement, and eventually towards an agreement on agreement.
Thank you, Patrick and Sandra. I would like to go more into the work you have been doing in these two platforms. And Sandra, as I was telling before, you co-chaired this global assessment of the IPBES, which had a tremendous impact. And in several papers and interview, you said that this work had built on the integration of multiple knowledge systems. Can you tell us more about what you mean by that and how it concretely worked. I think this is important for this knowledge brokerage session.
Okay, thank you. As I said, and Michelle said, Marianne said, sorry, I am a plant ecologist, right? But IPBES had given us a hugely ambitious mandate. IPBES was supposed to deal with everything about biodiversity and what it means to people and what people are doing to biodiversity, all from the perspective of the natural sciences, social sciences, and other knowledge systems. For example, indigenous people, local communities, etc. This vision wasn't new. It has been had before, and it has mostly failed or achieved only highly insufficient results. And this time we decided we would do our very best to honor the mandate as much as possible. That was our first mistake. I think we, from the personal point of view, that was the first mistake because it had huge cost. The reason why it hadn't been working very well in the past, and the reason why, if you remember, IPBES took ages to get finally approved as a process, is because the actors other than ecologists or to some degree economists didn't engage or actively resisted the process. And the reason why is because the categories used and the questions, no matter how good the intentions were mostly those of ecology. So it was like, you have someone and you wanted to give them a shoe to wear, and the shoe is not only the wrong size, also has the opening in the wrong place, and it has a completely wrong shape according to the foot. So no wonder why people don't want to wear that shoe. So the first thing we engaged in was a very long, highly participatory process of about 3 years in actually building together a shared conceptual framework with all the actors at the table. And the idea was to find a very small number of, maybe we can have the second slide. This is the IPBES, the official version of the IPBES conceptual framework. It's super simple, but it contains categories that are meaningful and important to all actors involved, and allows making questions that are relevant questions to all the actors. So the actors agree on what are the questions to address, even if they then don't agree on the answers. And it's not, sorry, just go back, yeah. It has many things that could be improved, but to the best of my knowledge, this is the first time that a conceptual framework in the global intergovernmental interface explicitly acknowledges different knowledge systems represented here in green and blue. And I will stop here because first, Marianne is going to stop me anyway, because there's no time. And second, because I am going to give a full keynote talk on the conceptual framework and nature's contributions to people on 28 November. So if you are interested in knowing more, you are cordially invited.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm almost done. I just said that the process, simple as it is, perfectible it is, was far from easy. because every actor that sits at the table comes with their own intellectual boxes, and finding a shared set of intellectual boxes that mean abandoning your own boxes, the ones you feel comfortable with, was a really difficult process. Incredibly enriching, but really difficult. And now I am proud of it, but during the process, I many times regretted and said, what the hell I'm doing? Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's a strong conclusion. Thank you, Sandra. Patrick, I would like to ask you how these HLPE reports are seized by the political sphere. We are discussing this science policy interface. So what is the process of approval of the HLPE report? There is this strong transdisciplinary component also in the CFS and HLPE. Can you tell us more about that?
Maybe before answering directly the question, maybe just a few words to say very quickly how it works, because every panel, we saw that this morning, has its own rules and does not work exactly the same way. The HLPE was created by the CFS, the UN Committee on World Food Security itself, created in 1974, when after the hunger riots, to be an evidence-based type of panel that would inform policymaking. So it mainly works on requests from the CFS, and the CFS takes its time to negotiate what is the topic they want a report for. And this negotiation takes 4 months, more or less. Then they request it, and then the production of the report takes 2 years, joining all the experts on the world, hopefully. And then after 2 years of independent work, based on rigor, based on integrating all types of knowledge and not just scientific evidence. This is one key issue. The report is delivered and is a kickstart of a political negotiation. Once we know about that, we also have to take into account that the CFS reform in 2009 had also another component, that is to move away from a strict intergovernmental political arena to incorporate the representation of civil society and the representation of the private sector. So they are also part of the discussion. And then now that you know that, well, the 2 years of production of a report, there are 12, it's not canonic, but there are 12 steps to move forward. And these 12 steps involve consultation, broad consultation, public consultation, including non-scientific, scientific and non-scientific stakeholders, and peer review. But differently from other panels, it does not include validation of the content by the governments. And in no moment there is a validation. It is a completely independent process. The governments are happy and free to come during the consultation process, and this is widely shared and publicly shared, but there is no approval by the government and the public authorities. So you can see that bringing knowledge different comes in different stages. First of all, it comes because the steering committee itself, made of 15 persons, are from very different geographic and disciplinary backgrounds. And they, of course, fight a lot. Second, each time that we receive a request, the steering committee is composing a team of the 10 to 15 experts on that particular issue who are building the report, and we look for the bigger, larger diversity of disciplines, of thoughts, of points of views, to make sure that we can address the controversies and the different point of view. So different disciplines and different background. And then this is based on what we call the collective intelligence. That is, there was a very interesting expression of one of the reports. They have worked incredibly mad for during 2 years, for the report. This was on multi-stakeholder partnership, and the coordinator of the team was from the University of Pretoria. And then at the end of the 2 years, we took the report as a steering committee and we said, we make it our report. And they were saying, you are stealing our baby. Yes, we were stealing their baby, because the idea was to make it a collective report and a collective intelligence. So as you see, the integration of different type of knowledge and different disciplinary points of view comes in very different moments in the negotiation process, during the open consultation, during the peer review. And then this is, if we take the 3 pillars of interdisciplinarity, of transdisciplinarity, as we discussed it last time, this shows very well how we move beyond disciplinary boundary. Secondly, how we integrate the non-scientific knowledge, making sure that they are not the same and they have different patterns and different legitimacy, but we try to integrate them, and how we also interact with society and decision makers, because it's at the heart, before, during, and after the process of producing the report.
Thank you, Patrick. We can see that there are some similarities in the 2 expert committees, in the way different knowledge systems are integrated. And there are some differences on the relationship with the political sphere. But if you agree, Sandra, I would like to open the floor. We are running late of time, to start the discussion, and we can add some inputs on how the system works with the room, because this is really important for us, that we have this interactive discussion. So I don't know if there is any question from the room. Please don't be shy and speak loudly. That would be appreciated. Yes, please.
You mentioned that when you started the report, or to gather knowledge, you realized there were gaps in the knowledge. I'm wondering if this knowledge of the gaps had an impact on the research, on the research areas. Like, did it change the way labs were working, or did they have new domains of science emerge?
Yeah,
how did that work, or if it didn't work? How can it be done that we learn the scientific work from the gaps?
I will repeat so that people also online can hear. You mentioned that there were gaps in the process, strong gaps. Did it change the way scientists were working together? New fields of study emerged from that? What did it bring to the work of scientists?
Thank you. The gaps were in the literature, actually. By mandate, IPBES reports, as well as IPCC reports, can only be based on written sources, right? So when we detected that the sources simply didn't have the answers we wanted, we tried to embark in a fast process to produce it. Yeah. It wasn't primary research, but we were allowed to do meta-analysis or systematic review. That was according to the rules. So in some cases, we managed within the 3 years. In some cases, it was just not possible. So we flagged the gap. And at the end of our reports, there is a list of gaps and questions for further research. So the scientific community could take inspiration from that and solve it.
Thank you. Cal.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. My question is about best practice. And I think that both of you have such immense experience that in addition to all of your other expertise, you now know everything from like really best practice to probably really poor practice, because you've accumulated such experience and knowledge of example and of projects and of scientific approaches and policy approaches, best practice and bad practice. And so I'm really interested in your experience with best practices, and especially best practices that have been integrated across different kinds of knowledge. Because I feel like, for example, to see the diagram of the knowledge systems with Mother Earth in such a prominent position, obviously referring to the indigenous epistemologies and knowledge, and yet you're all scientists. And so is there, for example, a best practice of how that kind of deep cultural indigenous knowledge actually connects with scientific practice? Or are these knowledge domains just like important to respect and acknowledge, but they don't really like connect that much? It's about kind of connecting across knowledge domains in the politics of knowledge. And I'm giving the example of Mother Earth and ecological science, but of course development approaches and would have their own. And I'm just wondering if you have best practice examples that you can share.
Yeah, one way in which this knowledge can meet to some degree is a shared conceptual framework, that the one we try to build. Again, this conceptual framework is not fully consistent with any of the knowledge systems, right? Nobody's happy with it. Yeah. I decided we had succeeded with when I discovered that everyone was equally unhappy with it. A conceptual framework like that can only be a meeting place, right? Not perfect. It's not your own semantic and epistemology, but it's a place where everybody can sit on the same table, more or less at the same level. Of course, at the detail level, there's a lot of incompatibility. But then the challenge is sitting together and discuss until we finally identified some high-level message on which we all agree, right? And which still has teeth, because it's very common in international reports that in order to agree, you dilute, and then you find something that everyone agrees but has no teeth. It's just something bland and useless to everyone. So the challenge is really integrate what, the conceptual frameworks of Mother Earth and my own field of community ecology will never fully match, but we can agree on some messages that are actionable to recommend to policymakers. One thing in which IPBES, I think, went much further than any other intergovernmental interface was in really engaging with indigenous peoples and local communities. We have a number of ways. I even have a slide with it, but I don't know whether we have time to show all the many ways in which we try to engage them very meaningfully. But I don't claim that the process is complete. I think we are just starting and just a very, very few initial steps, but I would say are very important steps, because before IPBES, the indigenous organizations were cautious and a little bit wary, to say the least. And during IPBES, I believe we won a lot of their trust and a lot of the engagement, and they're actually using it a lot. So it's one of my bigger sources of pride has been having gone this far. And this is some of examples of the kind of activities we did to meaningfully engage with them. Probably the key of it, and my strong recommendation would be not try to design meetings to which you invite them, but the other way around. Try to connect them and say, look, can we go to your meeting? And in what way can we be useful to you? Mm-hmm. That's Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Patrick, would you agree with Sandra when she said that IPBES is more advanced than other platforms on this integration of indigenous knowledge? And you are telling us for a certain number of years, I would say, that you would like to see these different platforms working more together. Can you answer these 2 points together?
Yes, I'll try. These are many questions together. Well, first of all, I would not fall into the trap to compare the two of them. And there is no one best or practice or bad practice. I will answer what you asked for and what Carl asked for, beginning with two issues. Number one, we had the same experience as IPBES about drafting and designing a conceptual framework. That was on food systems, and that was in a report produced in 2017, which was a fantastic exercise to think together. But then when it comes to just designing a conceptual framework, you can say, well, so what? And the beauty of it is, as you ask for best practice or bad practice, I would not say it's a best practice. It's a practice. And what is interesting is to challenge the capacity of such an exercise to generate something new. This is the beauty of it, is to check whether it is able or not to generate something new. And this something new, you do not always know in advance what it will be. It could be an action by a local civil society organization that will take it to look for accountability, as we heard last time. It could be a research institution that takes over this conceptual framework to design a program, its own strategy and program. It could be like the one on food system, to have it to draft global voluntary guidelines for food systems, which was a huge political process that was derived from our report. It could be at the UN Food System Summit that was organized and that took on board our conceptual framework. It could be many things, but it's a practice, and I would not necessarily call it best practice. And the second issue is then I will go to Marianne's questions. The second example I will take is, as I said and as I mentioned, there is no political validation of the content of the report of HLPE, contrarily to IPBES and to IPCC. And for some people, this is the reason, we heard that from Esther, this is the reason why some people do consider that there is no IPCC on food. Well, I would call the HLPE IPCC-like type of panel on food because of its roots. But one is not better than the other. It's just address different objectives. And if you look at all these panels, they all have their own history. They all embed in a different landscape. They all have their mission, objective, scientific communities, metrics, concepts, agenda, modality of decision-making and interaction with policy. There is not one better than the other. They are just different for political reason. But then, and I finish with that, and this is why I try to share in Rome. I spoke in French, so I could, there is I could not say it in English, although I say it today, but I have a dream. But in French, it's much better to say it. It's much easier to not repeat. And the dream is to make sure that those different panels can work together and can exchange together when it comes to complex issues like, for example, food systems. Because we all know that biodiversity erosion, climate change, food security, emergence of diseases, political stability, etc., are very connected processes, and that we have to build collective intelligence on that rather than just working in silos. Of course, each of these panels has its rationality and its utility. And I'm not criticizing this, but finding a place where we could exchange and build a common vision, a common roadmap and milestones to work out some political, complex problems. And then we would like, as we are in Montpellier, to offer in Montpellier in 2023 the organization of an event bringing together IPCC, IPBES, HLPE, One Health Panel, the SPI on desertification, etc., to work on such an issue. And as we are in Montpellier, to look at how to work out feed, protect, and care. That is how to connect the challenges of agriculture, food, environment, and health.
Thank you, Patrick. Sandra, a final reaction on what Patrick just said. What do you think about it very quickly, because we need to give the floor to other duos. Do you think it will multiply this knowledge brokerage effect to have this panel working together, that it could? What would be the impact on the policy process?
Okay, I couldn't agree more strongly with Patrick. Definitely. We cannot afford the repetition and duplication we are seeing today in the landscape. They are all the panels are addressing different symptoms of the same root causes first. All the panels are competing for money, for the time of the researchers and the experts that work for them. So, and we are at risk of giving recommendations that cancel each other, typically climate, food, and biodiversity. We are not careful. So you said something very, very interesting, Patrick. You say everybody wants to create their own panel. We cannot afford that. We need to join forces. That would be my final reactions to what he said.
Thanks a lot. I think with this short discussion, we have a beginning of something maybe bigger for 2023, and maybe you will still be in Montpellier at that time.
I will have to come back. I am allowed a 30 seconds reaction on this morning's conversation.
Yes, of course.
Okay. I found what Salim and Esther said this morning very, very interesting, and I agree with most of what they have said. And there are many ways in which these intergovernmental or intersectorial panels are perfectible and are not doing as good as they could. But I think that while we are in the process of building something better, we need to defend. Right? Integrated, coordinated, but we don't want to throw them away. Because as Esther says, they empower people a lot. They are used by many social actors. So I think that that's a very important thing. When we see the impact the products of these panels have in making society aware and in empowering civil society, I think we need to perfect them, but we need to defend them. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we can.
Well, I'm not seeing the faces of Helen and Nick. Are you there? Hello? Oh, yeah. Hello, Nick. Nice to see you. And hello, Helen.
Hello.
Okay. Hello. Nice to see you too. I'm so happy to be here. I know it's almost noon and we are all hungry. I hope you have something at home, though. And well, with this great two previous roundtables, I think we have all the energy to synthesize this morning. Thank you, Marianne, Patrick, and Sarah for organizing it. And we have here two wonderful panelists as well. One is a media expert and also an anthropologist. And the other one is so difficult to define, Helen, because you are so interdisciplinary, but she's a sustainability expert. And also she's a privileged dialogue broker with companies and the business sector. which I think are two key issues we cannot disregard when we are talking about knowledge brokerage. So I will first introduce Helen, if you allow me, Nick. Helen Etchanchu is a professor in entrepreneurship and strategy department at the Montpellier Business School here in Montpellier. She's also the chairholder and communication and organizing for sustainability transformations project manager, COAST. She's the director of a center which could have not a better name, IPBES, which means inclusive management, prosperity, and collective transformations for sustainability. Helen specializes in the role of companies and business in society, and in particular, the struggles for meaning and power between political actors, the civil society, and large companies. What I really liked is that she faces the major challenges of our time, like climate change, inequalities, and health, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. And she has focused in her PhD research on the discourses of companies, especially when dealing with shale gas, energy, tobacco, and the digital and social economy. So thank you very much for being here, Helen. And regarding Nick Ishmael-Perkins, he is a senior consultant at the International Science Council, where he leads a program on the public value of science. Well, he has more than 30 years of experience working all over the world in participatory global development, including the Middle East, Southern Asia, and the Caribbean, where he was born. Nick has done several projects leading to real change in the media, and he has been awarded for this outstanding achievement, including by the Commonwealth Broadcasting Association. Both of them have such a long CV that we have to synthesize a little bit, but I wanted to say that Nick was also the director of Science DevNet, the science journalism platform for low and middle income countries that I admire so much. And also that he has a master's in anthropology and social transformation for the University of Sussex. And finally, last but not least, he's the artistic director of Wretched Theatre, which is a theater company working with migrant artists in the United Kingdom. So these are two very intriguing intervenants. Yes? Okay. Can I start with Helen, please? Thanks very much. I just disconnected it. All right, thanks. For us to understand what we are talking about, Helen, could you please start by defining what is science communication for you? And of course, you are going to bring this link to knowledge brokerage, which is the link between science communication and knowledge brokerage. And could you give us some concrete examples about the climate change field, which is one of your main areas of expertise? Which are the levers that we should activate so that the way we communicate science can lead to meaningful policy decisions?
Thank you so much for this introduction. And well, I mean, what a way to start with these big questions. So first of all, I would like to, before going into the depths of science communication and the role of science communication, and maybe sharing a few do's and don'ts. First of all, I would like to make sure that you understand where I'm coming from, because I'm a professor at a business school. So indeed, for me, why would I focus on communication so much? It's really based on these two main pillars that we work on with Domenico and Tony in the COAST chair. The first pillar in COAST, it's communication, and then the second pillar, it's organizing. And for us, really, these two pillars are intimately intertwined. So why focus on communication? It's because in order to change and transform our organizational practices, you talked about the the brokerage with businesses, which is so important, obviously, in a business school earlier. So in order to change these organizational practices, business models, we need to, first of all, also change our mindsets. And in order to change mindsets, so as soon as we get into this cultural and cognitive dimension of sustainable transformation, then communication becomes key in terms of the key medium that we use in order to make sense of the world. So that's why communication is so important, and science communication in particular is important. Well, specifically with grand challenges such as the SDGs, and most importantly, climate change, which I'm focusing on my most recent research. So climate science communication, and I mean, the discussion we had just before on the different international intergovernmental panels, the role of the IPCC, obviously, it's so mainstream now that the general public tries to appropriate climate science, which is a super complex field, obviously. So how can scientists communicate with the broader public, with different publics that they are not used to communicate with? So we heard about different challenges earlier. I think choosing the right language, the right tools to communicate and educate your audience, it's really one of the critical issues. So I would say the general pitfall in this field is that, you want to communicate, you want to educate around all of your knowledge that you have on science, and to make people understand, that there's a climate emergency and all the complexities of this, and how we can potentially, tackle these complex issues. But the problem with this attitude is that you have this what we call the knowledge deficit model of climate science communication. So that you think, okay, your audience, they have a deficit in terms of the academic knowledge that you have, that you want to transfer to them, and most of the climate science communication nowadays is still within this now outdated model. So this is one of the pitfalls. Another pitfall is alarming messages. I know that this is one of the questions that we'll come back to later, so I won't talk too much about this right now. Which is, for a starter, which is important and necessary to a certain extent, but we cannot stop there either, because otherwise we're not going to trigger this I would say this awareness action gap that we also talk a lot about in science communication, right? So one thing is to raise awareness through communication, but then it's a whole different story to actually trigger action afterwards. So maybe then I would just conclude this. You talked about the broad definition, or I don't know if I can give a good definition, but maybe a vision of a good science communication model that I would like to share. That there's different models out there, but the one that we promote with the co-chair and our most recent research and the climate communication report that I can, by the way, share also afterwards with the people in the audience who are interested. So it's called the CAUSE model, C-A-U-S-E, CAUSE model, which basically are different steps of how to communicate with different audiences around around science in general, but we applied this specifically to climate science. So the first step, the C, stands for confidence. So build confidence in the message that you're delivering. This, as a scientist, generally it's quite easy, right? So the first step, it's really to build this. So that's credibility.
Thank you.
Once you have that, then the second step is awareness. So yeah, is this too much? Sorry.
No, it's
Can
wonderful.
you hear me?
It was just a little bit cut, and we stopped in awareness, which is such a keyword, so important. Could you develop on that, Ellen?
Yes. So the second, it's awareness, in terms of raising awareness about what is going on, raising facts. So, for example, again, the link with climate science would be when there's extreme weather events, to use this in order to create awareness around the links between extreme weather events and climate science. Then the third step would be understanding. So once there's awareness, which I would argue currently, broadly speaking at a societal level, I think that's in this phase where we are right now. So there's, generally speaking, much stronger awareness now around climate issues. But at this stage, there's a lack of understanding indeed. So understanding the complexities and what are the causes and what are the consequences, and what are the where's the power to act in the end? Where can we actually intervene in these complex issues? So that's key. And here again, the role of scientists is so important in order to create this and diffuse this understanding. Then the next step is support. And here again, a very small hint towards how we frame the messages. Again, I will talk in more depth later in terms of examples, but how to build support for the message that you're delivering. And so for climate action, indeed, you need to bridge this gap between just understanding the problem and then acting on the problem. And in order to do this, you need to build support. And that is generally through emotions, generating positive emotions, positive emotional energy to act. And then the final stage is engagement. So this is really when you're at this stage, then people are engaged in the cause, in the topic that you are communicating, and they are ready to act and be on board. So that's, I guess I would stop here as a broad definition of the field of climate science communication.
It's a beautiful model. Thank you very much, Helen, for sharing it. And I am stopping here in the awareness step, because I have the impression, especially coming from Southern America and from Brazil more specifically, that being aware of a problem does not necessarily lead to change, as you well said in the following two steps of support and engagement. But sometimes I have an impression that we are more inclined to believe and to act following fake news about the environment, for instance, or misinformation campaigns, than, genuine scientifically produced knowledge. So the question that I would like to ask to Nick is, Nick, can you react on what Ellen just said about what is science communication, and how is scientific communication critical to addressing scientific misinformation campaigns, fake news? Why are we inclined sometimes to separate information that is not scientifically or evidence-based? And how can we change it or rattle it?
Thank you, Gabriella, and good morning, folks. It's been an exciting morning to listen to some of the other speakers, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to make a little bit of a contribution. So I was very strongly in agreement with a number of the comments that Helen made. I fundamentally agree that actually effective scientific communication or science communication is about a cognitive shift. It's not just actually around kind of creating awareness, and that it needs to be socially embedded and personally internalized to be able to affect this stuff. Also very pleased to hear, Helen say that we really have to be mindful of moving away from the deficit model, which is to think that, basically other people know nothing and we just need to tell them what to know and everything is fine. And I guess the key thing here to underpin what I was hearing from Helen and what I would strongly advocate for is that science communication or science engagement is really a process. And that the messaging is not so much what you say, but how you behave. It's about the worldview and the philosophy that underpins your approach to engaging with other people. And there are also, and this is worth saying, that really effective science communication, there are very few times that it's directive. And the example I often give to people is when there's a burning building and you tell people, okay, you need to evacuate now. But there are very few situations where it is that clear what the problem is and what the solution is. And even then, when you have something like a pandemic, it's difficult to sustain that kind of directive in communication over any length of time. And we have many examples of where this is broken down. So it's important to recognize that science communication is not about, and this extends to the policy interface as well, it's not simply about telling people, okay, this is what you need to do. This very, very rarely works, as I say, unless you can guarantee me that this is a situation very much like a burning building right now, and that everybody agrees that there's a problem and that this is the kind of solution that's required. I want to then go on to your reference to misinformation. And I'm going to start by saying something which is perhaps a little controversial, which is to say that misinformation is actually quite a common phenomenon in science, the scientific practice, scientific inquiry, and in some ways is even inevitable. And this points to something that I think is a huge issue for us. And it is the fact that the way we tend to communicate about science is directly at odds with the way that we practice science. You know, the practice of science is about the incremental diminishment of uncertainty. When we talk about communicating science, particularly in view of the policy interface, and we heard some of the speakers talk about this earlier, like Esther, for instance, we tend to think about it as an absolute. And again, thinking about it as a directive, and this is what policy wants, is that they, you know, often we talk about, don't tell me the facts, tell me what they mean so that I know what to do, with some mediation, and I'll get to that mediation in a minute. So this is important to recognize that misinformation is, and actually the more honest we are about the inevitability of misinformation in a way, the easier it is to build credibility. Because I have been caught many times in conversations with folks, including up to last week with my uncle, where people say, yeah, but they didn't know what they're talking about. I mean, you know, they said actually that you only need 2 vaccines. It's talking about COVID. And now actually you don't know how many you need. And actually, and this is stuff that I have experienced before when I was involved in polio campaign in Uttar Pradesh in north of India. And so, you know, kind of trying to move away from communicating in absolutes and building an understanding about how science knowledge, the epistemic community works, how knowledge is accumulated and consolidated is very helpful. Finally, I want to say actually that it is important, I think, for us to, just in the context of your question, Gabriella, to distinguish between misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah.
And disinformation here is, as one of my colleagues often says, we're talking about propaganda in science. And, you know, scientists often think, actually, oh, I tell the truth and then there it is and everybody should listen. But actually, the truth is that if you say something that has enough consequence and is disruptive enough, there are people who will take an interest and then actively mobilize against it. And I think sometimes that actually we tend to be a bit naive about that. This extends as well to understanding how policy processes or policymakers, what their environment is, you know, understanding the relationships around patronage, for instance. But I should stop there. I used to work in radio, so I know what it's like when you're trying to kind of keep the time. So I'm going to stop.
Oh, you're fascinating, Nick. It's a pleasure to listen to you and Helen. And speaking about mobilization, there was a strong mobilization, Helen, of scientists last weekend in different cities in Europe, including here in Montpellier, at the call of the Scientist Rebellion Group to alert decision makers on the climate emergency. You are all aware of this. And so you are also very active and you are a per se mobilizer. And you're also a politically elected decision maker, I think. I didn't mention this in your bio, but I would like you to tell us a little bit about your decision to be politically engaged in your commune. And at the same time, you have co-founded this amazing organization, Scientists for Future. And so the question here is, of course, you cannot just look at the information, produce knowledge, but you also want to take in action because you have 2 kids yourself, you have 2 children, and you are very, very worried about the future that awaits for them. So my question is, which is the border between being a scientist and an activist or being mobilized? Can you define your role, Helen, and which is the border, if there is one? And I think we are frozen. Yeah, but I can ask you too, Nick, about this. Because you're also very engaged in participatory, well, I think Helen is coming back, but you are also very engaged through art, for instance, through the arts. Can you tell us a little bit about this theater that you founded in the United Kingdom, directly linked to migrants? That's so fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's okay. So let me just deal very specifically with your question around kind of the line between science and activism. And you know, in the program that I'm running with the International Science Council called The Public Value of Science, we have a panel of experts. And we had a discussion in one of our meetings about exactly this. I mean, we approached it in a slightly different way, but the broad consensus with the panel was that actually there is an issue around stating where the facts of the science, as it were, and being very clear about that, and then being very clear about your position and why you take that position. But the panel was also very clear that in this world of what we call post-normal science, where in fact oftentimes the science comes with implications around contested values, because the idea is that we've moved away from straightforward things like the discovery of penicillin, and now we're talking about issues like how to deal with nuclear waste, which actually has larger impacts about our visions around society, and therefore is subject to some kind of capture. And that it's actually now there's a moral responsibility for scientists to think carefully about issues around dual usage. And that, so basically presenting this knowledge, there is also an obligation to be able to contextualize it. And as scientists to be able to say, this is what I anticipate the application could be, this is what I would recommend the application is, and that this has to, because again, if we're thinking about the policy interface, not just the facts tell me what they mean, and so basically being able to offer up some analysis, which will then be mediated nonetheless, is actually really quite important. So anyway, that's my little perspective on the issue around kind of science and activism. But on your question about, and I was very intrigued by this because it's a question I get a lot where people say, actually, so what's the link between, you're doing your science communication and then you have this theatre company and I mean, I don't often deliberately try to draw a link between the two. I happen to love theatre, and I happen to love theatre that particularly does kind of multicultural collaborative practice, as we call it. But I mean, there are two ways to answer this question, right? So the first thing that we probably need to be aware of is that, science communication and the cultural industries have a long-standing and very high-profile partnership, as it were. There are many instances of science fiction reimagining our aspirations, our dreams, and indeed our nightmares. And many times it draws on what is possible, because actually writers are working with the tech that they're seeing and imagining where it could go, or they're actually actively engaging scientists around what the research agenda might be. And so you have many examples of this around things like contagion, or, I mean, within the field of AI, artificial intelligence, again, there is a whole canon of literature and theatre and films. So in some regards, actually, it is not that unusual. In fact, pop culture is full of examples, sort of what this might look like. But I think that perhaps to look at this a bit more academically, one of the things that's really exercising scholars in science communication at the moment is what they call created audiences. And this comes from this idea that, because, as I was saying before, science communication is a process, that you need to create spaces and facilitate spaces for not only dialogue, but for co-creation. And therefore, you will have, those spaces may come in all sorts of modalities, all sorts of modes, but theatre is a good example of that. And there's a process, a genre of theatre called theatre for development, which draws on Augusto Boal, and yeah, exactly. And there, this is again very easy for us to apply questions around science, in this idea of building audiences and having conversations that are shaped around co-creation. I mean, and just to explain a little bit, because I don't know how familiar people might be with the idea of co-creation in science communication or science engagement. And note, the thing about process here is that then we're saying that science communication is not what just comes at the end of the scientific inquiry. This is really important to understand. So then you're talking about the agenda setting, about the methodological deliberation, particularly about transdisciplinarity, which is where you have different knowledge systems, because actually it's now, you're not just talking about different scientific disciplines, you're also talking about different professions, and indeed talking about very different epistemic communities. So you might talk about indigenous knowledge systems, for instance. And the point about transdisciplinarity is that there is a kind of mutual interrogation of these knowledge systems.
I love this, but sorry.
Yeah.
I was thinking of Sandra Díaz's explanation about the involvement of indigenous communities too. And all the time I wonder, are we really really communicating, because sometimes they have to go, these different audiences, to a process of, I don't know, how could I call it? I will call it straightly like whitening the discourse. You know, you have to occidentalize your discourse in order to be accepted and to be read or listened to. So I was thinking about this engagement of the traditional communities. And the nice thing about it is that, Sandra, they submitted their reports for validation or for legitimation or for correction to the indigenous communities. And the question I would like to ask you is regarding theater and the arts. Mm-hmm. Do you think it is really possible for a politician to pay attention to what the arts have to say regarding sustainable transformations?
Yes. Okay. And I think this is a very important question. And I think that your question actually reveals a fundamental and pervasive misunderstanding about what who policymakers are, right? Yes. I mean, and that's not, I mean, obviously, to be clear, it's an intelligent question. And the reason I say that is because I think we have a notion that actually policymakers are somehow asocialized and ahistorical, that they exist in this space where it's just them and they're making decisions which they then pass down to the rest of the world. But in fact, actually, policymakers are very socially embedded. They exist within a configuration of relationships that we might understand as patronage. So to use a very simple, concrete example, I remember having a conversation actually with one of the advisors to the EU, it's the scientific advisory body for the European Parliament. And she was saying that actually, you know, it's really funny when they're trying to talk about polls that they have done, often the questions that they get is, but wait a minute, who is it? Who are this? So does this reflect what, you know, people in my countries think about these issues? And what they're trying to do, these policymakers, is to understand what their constituencies think. Because this is what's happening here, is that the leadership, as it were, that these policymakers are meant to present and demonstrate, is being informed by what they think their patronage wants. So whether this is their constituencies who are voting them in, whether it's the capitalists, businesses, whether it's other arms of public spheres who are actually important for maintaining them in their position, these are the considerations that they have. So if, for instance, something captures the public imagination profoundly, this will have an impact on what we can expect from policy. And
we will come back. Yeah, sorry. Yes, please finish. Yes. Yeah.
And that was just the point that I was going to make, is that actually, if you and I think that we have many examples of this, you know, sort of over the years. When we look at, I mean, we could talk about revolutions, whether we look at the end of apartheid in South Africa, for instance, and how pervasive this had become actually across the political discourse, actually, in that country and internationally, and the role that popular culture had in sustaining and driving that. We see actually a similar issue around climate change at the moment. And I mean, there are, of course, this now leads to a whole other conversation about where you get oppositional factions. But the point is that actually it does shape constituencies who in turn can have and do have influence on decision makers.
That's such a beautiful way of saying this, Nick. And if you allow me, and since we are speaking about decision makers, I would like to go back to Ellen. Thank you, Ellen. Can you hear us?
Yes. Sorry about this.
Thank you.
Decided to switch off my internet connection, so now I'm via my phone. So I hope that the video is fine. Otherwise, just let me know if you don't hear me. I prefer to shut off the video.
It's perfect.
Okay.
So as to finish the reasoning that we were having here with Nick, I would like to ask you a little bit about why you decided to become, you too, a decision maker, a political representative, and how does this dialogue with your scientific and also teaching roles and also as a mother, because I love very much when you said in a recent interview that you have 2 kids. I think they're aged 8 and 6 now, something like. I also have 3 kids, and so I know that you are a concerned citizen as well. So how do you wear so many hats? And does it work?
It's it's a constant struggle to find the right balance, indeed, between the different roles, and that's true for me, because obviously I'm pretty much open and transparent about this, but I think it's true for everyone, because we all wear different hats and different roles. I kind of come back to the question that you asked earlier before I was shut off by my internet, because this is related really in terms of activism, academic activism. And as we started to go down this path, I really don't like this activist label, and I don't identify myself with an activist, But so we actually do have a blog piece on this, and the difference between active and activist science communication, right? So indeed, so we made a point here to say, we are active but not activist. So that's a big difference in terms of again, how you position yourself and how you can, like you said, reconcile these different worlds that indeed are quite how can I say, it's distant from one another in terms of here again, in terms of mindsets and perspectives. So the good thing for me personally is that since I'm a communications scholar, I'm an organization scholar, but using communications and cognitive lenses, I come in with a lot of understanding, a lot of empathy, a lot of humility also, in terms of the complexity of the issues at hand, the complexity of human nature. So, and I think that's the main reason why I'm able to juggle with these different hats, is that whenever I change my official role, I adapt constantly to my audience and to the context in which I am. And I think that's the key, again, coming back to science communication or communication more broadly, right? I mean, that's the key in terms of an effective communication, is that you need to adapt your communication to your audience, right? So that's a challenge, but again, for me, it comes quite naturally. So coming back to the policy choice, I really think that for me, as you also mentioned, my kids, and again, here, this is really, I think I can speak on behalf of a lot of citizens, as a citizen and mother and parent, this idea of sustainable development as having a development that is sustainable also for future generations, then this idea of this abstract notion of future generations that we as an academic read in a definition, and that I teach to my students in the first introduction of sustainable management, right? It all of a sudden it becomes it becomes embodied, right? Because it becomes embodied by my own children. It's the next generation. And I think that's a main source of motivation for a lot of people today. It's to really have this in mind, that, sustainability, it's really there for the future of my children. And then once you tap into this, then you can really open up an immense amount of energy and positive energy, because people generally agree that, we want to have a world that is sustainable and that is livable also for our children. And this is how I can very nicely connect with different people also in different roles, because we are all, once you connect back to this intimate human nature, of all of us, then you get at a more, I would say, a more essential level of how to interconnect and how to relate with people. And then, so maybe just, again, one last sentence on the policy, since that was, the main focus of your question now. So how do I go about with policy decisions? So I'm just a city councillor. So unfortunately, I'm not the decision maker in that sense, right? So I am lobbying in a lot. So I really see myself, we talk about knowledge brokerage today. I really see myself as somebody who's lobbying constantly for sustainable transformation, wherever I am. And it's just really being outspoken and active about what you do. So for me, this is really the label that I would give this is embodied academia. So, wherever I am physically, I embody this sustainable transformation that we all have to undergo. And this is how I work I work here also at the local policy level, is that I try to, in a sense, I try to lead by example. I'm not there trying to tell other people what to do, because as we know, that doesn't work. But I try to, for example, when I go to a city hall meeting, I go there by bike. It's as stupid as this, but it's super powerful. And Nick mentioned this earlier, right, about the symbolic notion of our behavior. And that's, I really think as an academic, that's the most powerful vehicle that we have, science communicators, is this, it's to walk the talk.
I think both you and Nick, you embody optimism and you transmit a lot of positive energy, which obliges me to ask you, as a former journalist, I was in the past a political journalist, and we have an adage that says, that good news is not news. And so you can see that the media continue repeating apocalyptic messages. And sometimes we as scientists too, when we speak about biodiversity, for instance, we speak about massive extinction of biodiversity, climate change. What happens? What is the result or the impact of these apocalyptic messages? And do you think they are reaching for instance, decision makers, or are they immobilizing and generating inaction or pessimism? Let us say, are those apocalyptic messages freezing us? And I would like to hear Nick first, and then Ellen also have your reaction. And with this question, I think we will have to end, because people are starving here, aren't they? Yes, and so am I. Okay, so please, Nick, what do you think about this apocalyptic message?
First, I just want to really underscore what Helen was just saying. And I touched on this briefly in my previous response, but it is extremely important for scientists, I think, to recognize their social position, both institutionally and individually, because this affects and it helps to understand how people are making meaning around what they're saying. And this leads me in now to your question directly. It's really interesting, because I think there are probably a few observations I have around this. The first is to recognize that, in fact, the editorial position that you described just now, Gabriella, about, good news is not really news. This is perhaps familiar for what they call now legacy media, which is the traditional mainstream media. But in fact, a lot of news and information is consumed by people in emergent platforms. And there you have quite a different editorial position in many regards. They're coming at it with a very particular worldview around what matters about what is going on in the world and how they're making meaning of that. And in that regard, I think what is really interesting at the moment is that, across the discipline of science communication, a lot of conversation, the discipline as a whole, as a community, has become very exercised by moving away from what might be called supply design issues. So it's no longer really about, how to do social media, if to do social media, stuff like that, but really a lot of interest in the issue around reception and meaning making. Right. And this is, I can give you a few examples of this. So there's a whole fascinating body of work that's being done by two researchers called Claire Craig and Sarah Dillon around story listening as opposed to storytelling. The engagement of cognitive science and even philosophy of science. And the reason for that is because, of course, again, it's about understanding, interrogating how people are making meaning of science. And then you have also this kind of movement around designing for trust. And which is, again, a fascinating concept. Actually, the idea is that actually a lot of scientists and research institutions do not actually kind of think about their social and relational positioning. Actually, it's very much about the integrity of the inquiry. They think about knowledge provenance and knowledge integrity from the perspective of the quality of the practice, and not also considering actually their position. So this means that actually, we're thinking about things like political economy, of information sharing, developments in cognitive science, knowledge literacy. A whole range of stuff which I think are really fascinating and extremely important to understand the question that you're asking and how to answer that question. Are apocalyptic messages a problem? Are echo chamber is a problem, and you know, this kind of thing. And it's interesting because in the panel of experts in the Public Value of Science project, what for me is fascinating is that, you know, we have this kind of broad cross-disciplinary group who are coming at this from all different angles. The other thing about this, which is really important, is the partnerships with folks who are doing work in internet governance and on social policy units for tech platforms like at Meta, Wikipedia, so on. These are natural allies for scientists because they are actually very concerned about knowledge integrity, information provenance, and again, user behavior around these things. And so I'm very big now on suggesting organized science needs to be engaging actually in these areas of practice. And again, goes back to something that Esther said earlier about scientists thinking that it's all about what they do and they can make it right.
Thank you, Nick. And Ellen, how would you react to this? And I am approaching my colleague Sandra now, who is telling us that the gong is calling us. Okay, what would be your reaction, Ellen?
Yes, I will try to be brief. I'm first to echo also what Nick said, the way you framed the question in terms of journalism and the traditional legacy journalism in terms of good news is no news. I also think that that's something that is, still true within the mainstream journalism, of course. But it's also, behind this is a business model. So that business model of that typical kind of journalism, it's something that I, in my sense, also needs to change indeed, and can be changed, obviously. So I'm an advocate, and I work with people who work in solutions journalism, indeed. So the idea is not to be in good news management then, but to be constructive. So it's a different way in which you treat messages also in the news, in the media, in terms of not only showing the problems, but also proposing constructive solutions and showing the good things that are happening in order to address these challenges. And I think that's something that is really crucially missing in mainstream media today. So that's, about the media. And then in general, this big question is apocalyptic messaging good or bad in a sense? So I would say it serves its purpose. It serves its purpose again, at a societal level. It's super important to have these messages because that's the first step in order to create this cognitive dissonance and this motivation to change, to do something about it, right? So you do need a message that is, so not necessarily apocalyptic, but a message that is powerful enough in order to create this moral shock, a deep moral shock that questions then the way in which we've been doing things and motivates me to change things. So I see that we need to so I will stop here. Obviously, I could go much deeper, but I guess we have room for questions.
That's fascinating, Ellen. Thank you very much. And yes, I was going to invite our colleagues here. If any one of you would like to make a question to Ellen or Nick. They're all very attentive, but I think they're frozen. So, well, I think, Sarah, any question? No? I would like to thank you very much for your intervention. It's a pity we were the last ones, but the good point is that we had the chance to listen to the other duos as well. And I really hope to continue this dialogue with you in person in the future in Montpellier or wherever you want. Thank you very much, and a big applause for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing.
And I will not try to do a conclusion on content, of course. I would just like to thank Gabriela Litz, who was actually our first visiting scientist at MAK'IT, and she is still in Montpellier working for the Joint Research Unit on Languages. So thank you, Gabriela. And of course, thank you very much to our speakers today, virtually in the room, and people who were supposed to be in the room and who have last-minute issues and who still intervene virtually. So thank you very much to all of you. And I would like also to apologize for the delays we have experienced in our shows today due to these logistics difficulties at the beginning. But thank you to have participated. And I propose people who are here in person to continue the discussion around a nice lunch. It will be under the bed. It doesn't look very appealing, but still there is some table and nice food right in front of the coffee corner. And sorry for the people online, but we will enjoy for you, and we hope to see you in person soon in Montpellier. Thank you very much.
Fascinating. Still online, no?
They left.
But we will tell them.
Yes.
But I found this talks really were very important in the sense that they bring together knowledge and action. And they bring together knowledge and action with probably three challenges that we have to address from the science point of view to move beyond the traditional role of science to produce evidence and technology. It is to better help organizing our doubts in a more and more complex world where uncertainty and complexity is at the heart. Is to probably escape and move away from well, I would have said fake news, but disinformation, and making the difference between them. And it's to help address contradictory injunction by four different persons and for each one. And this is the red thread of this and of our journey, intellectual journey, and maybe operational journey to think about new initiatives in the future. And thanks for Sarah and to Marianne for organizing this great moment. Thank you.